Your glory, your glory, your glory is filling this place. Your glory, Almighty God, the Holy One, who was and is to come. Almighty God, the Holy One, who was and is to come. To come. You reign my God, you reign. You
Yeah. You're a man of your word, yeah. Yeah. Here we go. This is what it says. All things are possible when we believe. Old chains are breakable when we receive your way. You If you say I'm healed, if you say it, I believe. If you said it, if you say I'm free in my mind, if you said it, yeah, yeah. If you said it, believe it, yeah. If you said I am who you say I am. I am who you say I am. Say, I am who you say I am.
On here, you got me? All right. Let's jump back into our study that we started last week on marriage. Now, we didn't actually finish last week. And so tonight, our goal is to finish what we started last week. So if you have your notes sheet from last week, we never got to the last Roman numeral. Okay, we covered the others, but we didn't get to the last point, which is about God's design and plan for marriage. And I'm glad that we didn't make it there, because had I tried to squeeze it in, I wouldn't have been able to say, I think, everything that we need to say on this particular issue of what is God's plan, what's God's design, why marriage in the first place. So let me ask you guys a question. Have any of you ever heard of the term parthenogenesis? Parthenogenesis. Anybody? No? You're not reading a lot of like science journals, things like that? No? No? I mean, Parthenon does come from the same root, but it really has nothing to do with a building. Anybody? No? Parthenogenesis. I don't expect anybody to know it. Eli might know what it means, but... Well, you do hear the word Genesis in there, which in Greek comes from a Greek word that can mean to begin, but it's also the word that means to beget or give birth to. All right, and so that's a part of the word. The first half of the word comes from the Greek word parthenos, which means virgin. So it is literally. It refers to a virgin birth, but it's not a term that's used to refer to Mary giving birth to Jesus. It's not a theological term at all. It's a scientific term. It has nothing to do with theology. It just happens to be based upon Greek words, and the New Testament is written in Greek. But it refers to a very rare process in nature by which species that normally have to have some sort of male and female, that have some sort of sexual reproduction, okay? There has to be a male and a female. There has to be the joining together of their DNA, okay? So for animals that normally would reproduce in that way, there are these rare instances where these animals, where a female of the species will give birth without having ever come into contact with a male of the species. And it's called parthenogenesis, like a virgin birth. It doesn't involve a male at all. And essentially, the baby that is born is a clone of its mother, because there's not any additional DNA added in, right? Normally, we know how that works. You get half your DNA from your father, half from your mother, okay? As far as I know, there are no instances, no reports of this happening with mammals. But there have been a number of instances of it happening with fish and then occasionally with reptiles. It's most common of all things among sharks. So there have been, the way that they know for absolutely certain that that's what it is there have been sharks that have been in containers without any other sharks in them, or without any male sharks at least. And suddenly these female sharks are pregnant. They give birth to their young. And if you test the DNA, they have the exact same DNA as the mama shark. Parthenogenesis. And the whole reason I bring that up is because God could have set it up so that that's how everything reproduced. It's within the realm of possibility. There are even other ways in which living creatures reproduce, right? If you cut some worms in half, you literally have two worms, right? That's one of the ways in which they reproduce. So it doesn't do any good to chop up an earthworm and think it's going to die. You're just making more worms, and they're just going to grow into, full-size worms, right? So, there are other ways in which God could have designed us so that we could obey the command to be fruitful and multiply without male and female. But he didn't do that, and that's really significant. He didn't do that at all. In fact, he made it so that it is necessary for there to be a man and a woman in order for us to have children. And even today, where there's all sorts of interesting scientific things going on, and you will read in the news about a man giving birth. It's a biological woman that gives birth. It's always a biological woman, and the egg is always fertilized with DNA from a biological male. Nobody's overcome that hurdle yet. It's just part of God's design for humanity. But the fact that God could have done it another way, but that he did it this way, signifies that there's a reason. There's a design in things. And not just a random design as, well, I think I'll have those made in my image reproduced in the same way as the, dogs and cats and things like that. It's not just random. God has a purpose in it. And what we learned and what we saw last week when we were looking in the opening chapters of Genesis is that marriage is tied to those purposes. That God designed us, male and female, and he made it so that in order for us to obey his command that he gave to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply and exercise dominion over the earth, the only way for them to do that was to come together in marriage and have children. That's a part of God's plan and a part of God's design. We can get that much from Genesis. We can. But what Moses, who wrote Genesis, what Moses never tells us in Genesis is why God did it that way. He hints at it later on in the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books. He wrote the first 5. He gives us some really good hints at what God was doing. And then when you go further into the Old Testament, you read in the prophets and you get a much clearer picture of what God is up to in designing us so that we need to come together in marriage in order to have children. We get to see it a little bit more clearly in some of the ways that God talks about Israel. But it's really not until you get to the New Testament that you see a really clear reason for that. So, open up your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 5. This is where we are. What is God's plan and design for marriage? Why the differences? Because we spent most of our time last week talking about differences between men and women, right? Physical differences in relation to our preferences, all sorts of differences that we have. Why are these differences woven in to creation? And specifically, why are human beings designed like this? Ephesians chapter 5, I'm going to read this whole passage, and we're not going to talk about all the details of the passage tonight, but we're just trying to get at this, God's plan and design for marriage, trying to get at that. Verse 22, and I'm going to read to the end of the chapter. Paul says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband." So just to give you my quick summary, the reason that God created human beings, male and female, so that we might come together in marriage is so that our marriages would be a picture of the relationship that Christ has with his people. That's it. Marriage exists to be a picture of the relationship that Christ has with his people, the church. So why all the differences? Because there are differences between Jesus and his bride. There are. And if God had designed us in such a way that we were all the same, you wouldn't be able to see those differences. God has a plan in Genesis. And like everything else that God does in the Old Testament, it's moving toward Jesus, the whole thing. One of the interesting things that you read in the gospel is when Jesus is questioned about the resurrection of the dead. They're basically asking him questions about end times. They want to test him and see how he's going to answer their questions. And these particular Jewish religious leaders who decide to question Jesus about the resurrection, they belong to a group that doesn't believe in a future resurrection. Right? So some Jews in the first century believed that when Judgment Day came, God would raise the dead physically. Other Jews believed that no, that was not going to happen at all. There was not going to be a physical resurrection of the dead. And so they asked Jesus to try to get him to alienate someone, test him, see what he's going to say. And Jesus clearly sides with those. It's one of the few times that Jesus sides with the Pharisees, right? Jesus sides with those who believe in a future resurrection. The Pharisees believed in a future resurrection, and at least here Jesus says they're right. They're actually right. And so they ask him this really long, convoluted question. You might remember this particular story. They give Jesus basically a parable. He's always telling parables. They have their own parable. And they say, suppose a man, he marries a woman and they don't have any children and he dies. The law of Moses says that his brother is supposed to marry her, and the first child that they have will be counted as the other brother's child. It had to do with inheritance rights and all those sorts of things in the ancient world. And they say, so suppose she marries him, but before she has any children, he dies. And then you move to the third brother. Before she has any children, he dies. And so she goes through these brothers. She never has any children. And they say, so in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? To which Jesus at this point says, you are mistaken because you do not know the scriptures. He says that in the resurrection, there will be no more marriage. There will be no giving in marriage at all. It's not required. This means that what Jesus teaches about marriage is different than what a lot of people assume. A lot of people assume that you go to heaven and you find your spouse and you continue on your relationship. The Mormon church actually teaches that, they teach that marriage is eternal. It lasts forever. But that's not the case at all. Jesus says that after he returns and raises the dead and judges the world, there will be no more marriages between men and women. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that the only marriage that will continue in eternity is the marriage between Christ and his bride, the church. In fact, in the book of Revelation, chapter 21, and even in chapter 20, the end is described as a massive, huge wedding feast, where the bride is revealed in all of her splendor, spotless, without blemish, and she's joined to her husband, Christ. You don't need the picture when you have the reality. That's the point. You don't need it anymore. But until Christ returns, we don't have the reality. So that until then, every marriage exists, whether you're talking about believers or non-believers. It doesn't matter. This is a creation ordinance, which means it applies across the board. Every marriage exists to reflect the relationship that Jesus has with his bride. Why the differences? All those things we talked about last week. The things that in a fallen world just tend to complicate our lives and make them more difficult, because as sinful, fallen people, we don't sympathize with people that are different from us. We get irritated with them. I mean, that's just the way that we are because we're sinners. seems to create a lot of problems for us, but it has a purpose. And so we can't really make any headway, I don't think, as followers of Christ. We can't make any headway in improving our marriages or in seeing our marriages live up to what God's design is for them until we make it our goal to have our marriages become ever increasingly, so you're never finished with this, but to have them ever increasingly become an accurate picture of the relationship that Jesus has with the church. Now, there's a lot in these verses, 22 through 33, about the different roles that husbands and wives take on within marriage. But we're going to focus on the summary that Paul gives in verse 33. We started to talk about this last week. We talked about it a little bit. I mentioned it as one of the differences between men and women. But now I want to talk about it more, not so much as a difference that's ingrained into us, it is that, but as an obligation that's laid upon us by command. So verse 33. Let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So here's what we said last week about that verse. We said that this verse reflects something that's true about men and women in terms of our differences. That in general, men crave respect more than they crave love. And in general, women crave love more than they crave respect. So this is what I want you to discuss at your tables. What is the difference between loving someone and respecting someone? Now, I'm not saying that they're two totally different things, right? If you were in elementary school and they made you draw, do you remember drawing Venn diagrams? Remember the big circles and they overlap, right? Okay, so that's what we're dealing with here. There's overlap. I know that, okay? But there's also some stuff that belongs in each circle. So what I'd like you to talk about at your tables, and if you don't have enough people at your table to have a good discussion, then you can join another table. But I want you to talk about and there's not, at this point, I'm not looking for, I don't have anything jotted down as what I think is the right answer to this question, okay? I just want you to kind of talk and see if you can gain some insight from others at the table about the differences. What is the difference between loving someone and respecting someone? All right? So talk about that for, 3 or 4 minutes, and then I'm going to talk some more. All right. All right, let's see if we can glean some wisdom or cause some trouble. All right? Right, I know. Okay, so any particular table you feel like you have a nugget of wisdom that you'd like to share with us? Or at least information. Something you said at your table. Maybe it's not wisdom, but yes, ma'am. Okay. 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 All right. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Yeah, that's true. He was reminding us where Jesus says there's no greater love than a man lay down his life for his friends. No, not necessarily. No. Right. Okay. Yeah, there are. So, yeah, and this is where it is important to start thinking about the way that we use words, because sometimes we use words in different ways in different situations. So we might use a word in a really broad sense somewhere else, but in a very focused, narrow sense. So that sometimes when we talk about love, we're talking about something that's more of an emotion than anything else. But other times when we talk about love, we're talking about something that is, it still has an emotional component, but it's something that you act out, right? So we use the word love in different ways. And I think, too, we use the word respect in different ways sometimes. So that a lot of times we use the word respect today, and I think this has become the way that it's used like most frequently today, is respect often just refers to a general acknowledgement of someone's kind of right to exist almost. You know, I'm going to respect them, let them, and that we use respect in those ways. Right. Okay. Okay. From your perch. Okay. All right. I feel like we can't really, we just got to hear what Kevin says and just, deal with it because he's up there. Man, he speaks. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me say this. I think, and this is all good discussion, and this is how I wanted our discussion to function. But I think we need to ask a more important question than what's the difference between these two terms. What we need to ask is, how does Paul use these words in this passage? Okay? Because we're trying to figure out what he means by this command in verse 33. And whatever he means here is going to be determined by what he has said up to this point. Because like I said, we all use words in a variety of ways. Paul is even capable of using words in different ways in different contexts. So, like when you're doing a word study, you might do this sometime. You might decide to do a word study. You come across an interesting word and you're reading, you're going to do a word study. The most important information that you get for a word study is not the information that you get from a Bible dictionary or a lexicon or anything like that, anything that's going to define the words for you. The most important information you get is the context of the passage. You always look at how is the word used in this passage. And just a couple of observations, all right? One of the things that I've noticed as I've read this passage over the years is that husbands are commanded to love their wives, but wives are never commanded to love their husbands. And wives are commanded to respect their husbands, and yet husbands are never commanded to respect their wives. Now that sounds awful if you're reading a broad meaning of these terms into the passage. Like, what do you mean she doesn't have to love her husband? Or what do you mean he doesn't have to respect his wife? Like, it sounds terrible if you read in everything that we think about these words into this passage. But we don't want to do that, do we? We want to know what Paul means by this language. And he helps us to see exactly what he means, because verse 33 is a summary statement of everything else he says leading up to this point to husbands and wives. So let me just make a couple of other observations, all right? First of all, the love that is displayed here is not primarily an emotional display. It's love in action. Just let me read you the things that Christ does that fall under the umbrella of him loving the church. Verse 25, Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. He did something. He gave himself. Move down a little bit. Verse 28, in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. So, nourishing, cherishing. These are things Christ does for the church. So, he gives himself, and then there's a whole lot of other things that flow out of that giving, right? Sanctification, cleansing, all that sort of language. All that flows out of the giving, but Christ's initial act to get that stuff going is he gives himself. That's the cross. And then he nourishes and cherishes the church. Giving, loving, or giving, nourishing, cherishing. All those are terms that Paul uses to describe the love that Jesus has for the church. All that to say that this is an active love. That doesn't mean that there's not an effective emotional component to it. Okay? There is. Jesus doesn't do this out of mere duty. Okay? But that's not what Paul is focused upon. Paul is focused upon what Christ does. And in his doing, he loves the church. So, what expectation should we have as of men? We should expect that they do things that show their love. It doesn't mean that they don't ever use words. It doesn't mean that they're never emotive. Okay, it doesn't mean that at all. We're not excluding those things. I'm just saying, what is Paul requiring right here? He's requiring husbands to do things that demonstrate their love. Sacrificial things. Things that are good for her. When he nourishes and cherishes the church, he is seeking her good. So there's sacrificial action that aims at the good of the bride. That's what's to be expected of husbands. That's what's commanded. Let me put it that way. So this is not optional for husbands. We don't do things that demonstrate our love for our wives when they're worthy of it, because they might never be worthy of it. Think of Hosea and Gomer in the Old Testament. She was never worthy of the things he did for her. And it's a story with a lot of action in it. He does things. He pays prices. He takes shame upon himself before the whole community. He does things. And she's never worthy of it in the entire story. Husbands don't do these things because their wives deserve it. Christ did not lay down his life for the church because the church is made up of people who are lovable. Yeah. And it was to be a picture of God's relationship with his people, which is fulfilled here. So it's all pointing in this direction. Yeah. So that's one of the things I want to try as best I can to communicate to husbands. This is not optional. This does not come at your convenience, and it does not come when your wife behaves in a way that shows that she's worthy of your sacrifices. You sacrifice because that's what Jesus does. That's it. That's it. So you may have a wife that you consider to be exceedingly worthy of every sacrifice you could possibly make. Or you may not. You may have a wife that if you were to just let your sinful nature take over, you'd just rather never be around, never deal with. Right? It's possible. But it doesn't change what you're commanded to do. All right, so that's the guys. The ladies. So this word, respect, that's a soft translation. When I say soft, I don't mean wrong, but there are times when English translators translate things and they choose English words to avoid connotations of other possible translations. Maybe this will make more sense if I tell you what the word is. The word is fear. Now, we try to work our way around that word all the time, and usually we throw out, oh, well, it means respect. What does it mean to fear God? Well, we're not afraid of God. We just respect him. No, I'm afraid of God. Honestly, I'm afraid of. I love him. I know he loves me. I have no doubts about that. But he can give me cancer right now if he wants to. I'm afraid of him. I'm afraid of his providence because he doesn't owe me anything. So yeah, I'd rather be like Isaiah and just acknowledge it. Woe is me. I'm undone. So yeah, I'm afraid of him. It doesn't mean that I won't come to him because he's a father, right? Because Christ is a faithful mediator who protects me from the wrath that I deserve. But yeah, I'm afraid of him. And we all should be. Fear of God does involve respect, acknowledgement of who he is, but it's more than that. So when I say that, what I'm trying to tell you here is I don't think the fear that a wife or the respect that a wife is to demonstrate toward her husband should look exactly like the fear we should have toward the Lord, okay? Because the Lord has absolute sovereignty and husbands don't. But we're missing something if we don't see a connection. Here, I think, if I were to give you a definition of the word, I would say that respecting is an acknowledgement of the rightful authority and place that a person has. I'm drawing that from the context, not anywhere else. I wouldn't read that meaning into the word everywhere I found it. Just the context. Here's what wives are commanded to do. Wives, verse 22, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. Verse 24, now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their own husbands. And then there's the call for respect. So, respect is the acknowledgement of the role, the authority, the position, the place of a husband. It is not the acknowledgement of his worth or his worthiness. Because again, you may be married to someone who's not worthy of your respect. Right? That's not the point. Suppose you have a boss who is not a nice guy. You don't like him. You don't. Right? But you acknowledge his position and place in the workplace. It's an acknowledgement. I take respect to be an acknowledgement. Now, you have to pay attention to everything Paul says here. Because Paul places some pretty severe limits on the authority of a husband. Wives are, yes, to submit to their own husbands as to the Lord. But even that phrase, as to the Lord, is an indication that there's a broader context in which all this happens. So when a husband requires his wife to do something that the Lord forbids, there is a greater authority in place who is to be respected as a higher authority. So women should never follow their husband's lead into something sinful, ever. You shouldn't do it. There are some limits here. When a husband loves his wife by seeking her good and sacrificing for her, it's easier for her to see and acknowledge his role and his place in the family. When he doesn't, she's under no less of an obligation. She should never follow him into sin, but she should always acknowledge his place, his role. This is some kind of hard stuff, and I'm aware of that. But we have to kind of start here with what's God doing? He's putting on a display. He's building little portraits, little pictures of the relationship that Jesus has with the church. And without these two components, you can't paint that picture. It can't be done. Right? Jesus and his bride are not the same. And husbands and wives are not supposed to be the same. One is not of greater worth or value than the other. They're both aiming to put on a display of the relationship of Christ to his bride. They have the same general goal. But they don't do that by painting with the same brushes. If they paint with the same brushes, they paint the wrong picture. And we have to understand that. And we have to understand that verse 33 comes to us as a command. Let each one of you love his wife as himself. And let the wife see that she respects her husband. Those are commands. So when we don't want to do these things, we still have to. And when our spouse is not worthy of these things, we still have to. Because God has a plan. Sin. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Everybody. Yeah. Yeah. So, we don't have time for it. We'll save for next week. Here's what I want you to think about, and then I'll try to remember, we'll open up discussion with this next week. All right? But I want you to kind of discuss this, maybe at home, or if you have a Bible study group you go to, maybe, or accountability partner or something, you can talk about these things. I want you to talk about, for men, what is it that you either you can or you do already, but what is it that you can sacrifice, give up, that would actually be showing love to your wife? I mean, there's a lot of things you can give up, but it might not demonstrate love for your wife. If it doesn't show that you're nourishing and cherishing her, working for her good, then it's not really an act of love. So what are things that you can give up, sacrifice, that would be for her good? And for the ladies, I want you to discuss and talk about what are the barriers, what are the things that get in your way of respecting your husband? And how does the acknowledgement of this as a command affect that? Yep. What are some barriers? What are things that get in the way or make it difficult for you to respect your husband? And how does seeing verse 33 as a command affect your thinking about those things? Talk about those things, think about those things, pray through those things, and then next week we'll share a little bit of those thoughts that you've had or discussions that you've had, and then we'll move into the next section of our study. We're not going to leave this behind. This is going to kind of, this understanding this design or this blueprint for marriage is going to guide us through the rest of the study, okay? So we've spent 2 weeks on God's design, really. Last week, really, design of men and women. This week, purpose of marriage. And now next week, we are going to talk more specifically. We talked about it a little bit in our discussion, but we're going to talk more specifically about what does the Bible say about the effect of sin upon our pursuit of the ideal of Ephesians 5. It's an ideal, let's be honest. None of us lives up to it. So how does sin affect that? And then, what has Christ done that helps us to overcome those effects? And then what is the Spirit presently doing in us to overcome those effects. And then we get down to these two sort of special issues: divorce and remarriage, and then healing from some hurt. All right? Okay. Let me close us in prayer, and then you're free to go. God, thank you for letting us open up your word and think about it tonight. Because there's nothing more helpful for your people than to have Spirit-led meditation on the Scriptures, even together as a group. And so I thank you for the time that you've given us to do that. And I pray as we go through our week that every one of us would return over and over to your word and think about it. And that your Spirit would reveal ways in which we can apply your word to our lives. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Peace, bring it all to peace. The storms are